The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Royal Guardsman Thomas Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. Today marked his 20th year of service to the crown, and the weight of the medal pinned to his chest felt heavier than usual. Not because of its gold construction, but because of what it represented. 2 decades of unwavering dedication, countless sleepless nights, and sacrifices that had cost him more than most people could imagine. Thomas had joined the Royal Guard straight out of military school, young and eager to serve his country in the most prestigious way possible. His father, a former guardsman himself, had warned him about the demanding nature of the position. The long hours, the rigid discipline, the constant vigilance required to protect the royal family. It wasn't a job for everyone. But Thomas had been determined, driven by a deep sense of duty and honor that ran through his family's bloodline like an unbreakable chain. The ceremony today was meant to be a celebration. Thomas was receiving the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest honor a Royal Guard could achieve. His wife Sarah had pressed his uniform that morning, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed out every wrinkle. She understood better than anyone what this medal meant to her husband. It represented validation for all the missed family dinners, the holidays spent on duty, the bedtime stories he couldn't read to their daughter Emma because he was standing watch at the palace gates. As Thomas took his position in the courtyard, he caught sight of the crowd gathering behind the ceremonial barriers. Tourists and locals alike had come to witness the tradition, their cameras ready to capture the pomp and circumstance of the royal ceremony. Among them, he noticed a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and an expression that seemed oddly intense for such a celebratory occasion. She wore a bright red jacket and held herself with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she was accustomed to getting her way in most situations. Karen Henderson had arrived at the palace grounds that morning with a chip on her shoulder the size of a mountain. Her son Jake had applied to join the Royal Guard 3 times and been rejected each time. The official reasons varied: insufficient physical conditioning, failure to meet psychological evaluations, inability to demonstrate the required level of discipline. But Karen was convinced there was something more sinister at play. In her mind, the Royal Guard was an exclusive club that kept out deserving young men like her son, while elevating others who didn't deserve the honor. She had spent months researching the guards, learning their names, their backgrounds, their service records. Thomas Mitchell had become a particular focus of her resentment. Here was a man who had seemingly glided through his career without facing the obstacles her son had encountered. In Karen's twisted logic, Thomas's success was somehow connected to Jake's failures. She had convinced herself that if she could just expose what she saw as the unfairness of the system, justice would somehow be served. The ceremony began with the traditional fanfare. The Royal Herald announced the proceedings as dignitaries took their places on the reviewing stand. Thomas stood at attention, his mind drifting to thoughts of his daughter Emma, who was watching from the crowd with his wife. At 8 years old, Emma had only recently begun to understand what her father did for work. She knew he wore a special uniform and stood guard at important places, but the full weight of his service was still beyond her comprehension. As the medal presentation approached, Thomas allowed himself a moment of pride. 20 years of service had taught him that recognition was rare in his line of work. Most days passed without acknowledgement, without thanks, without anyone noticing the dedication required to maintain the security and dignity of the crown. This medal wasn't just a piece of metal. It was proof that his sacrifices had meaning, that his service mattered. The crowd grew restless as the ceremony continued, the formal speeches and military protocol testing the patience of those who had come expecting more excitement. Children fidgeted in their parents' arms while tourists checked their phones and wondered how much longer the event would last. But Karen remained focused, her eyes never leaving Thomas as he stood in formation with his fellow guards. When the moment finally arrived for the medal presentation, a hush fell over the courtyard. The commanding officer stepped forward with the ceremonial case containing Thomas's Distinguished Service Medal. The citation was read aloud, detailing Thomas's exemplary service record, his commitment to duty, and his embodiment of the values that made the Royal Guard a respected institution around the world. Thomas stepped forward to receive his honor, his heart pounding with a mixture of pride and humility. 20 years of preparation had led to this moment. As the medal was pinned to his uniform, he thought of his father, who had passed away just 2 years earlier without seeing his son achieve this recognition. He thought of Sarah, who had supported him through every challenge and setback. Most of all, he thought of Emma, and what this moment would mean to her understanding of service and dedication. The applause from the crowd was warm and genuine, a recognition of the sacrifice and commitment that Thomas represented. Fellow guards nodded their approval, understanding better than anyone what this achievement meant. Tourists captured photos and videos, adding this moment to their collection of royal memories. For most people in attendance, this was a pleasant diversion from their daily routines, a glimpse into the traditions that made their country special. But Karen saw something entirely different. As Thomas accepted his medal with quiet dignity, her resentment boiled over into something darker and more dangerous. In her mind, she wasn't witnessing a well-deserved recognition of dedicated service. Instead, she saw everything wrong with a system that had rejected her son while elevating men like Thomas. The injustice of it all, as she perceived it, demanded action. The ceremony was concluding, the formal proceedings winding down as officials prepared to disperse. Thomas remained at attention, the weight of his new medal, a tangible reminder of what he had achieved. He was looking forward to the small celebration his family had planned, a quiet dinner where he could finally relax and enjoy this moment of recognition. But Karen was already moving, her mind made up about what needed to happen next. 20 years of service, a lifetime of dedication, and a moment of hard-earned recognition were about to collide with one woman's misplaced anger and sense of injustice. The aftermath would change everything for everyone involved, in ways none of them could have imagined. The ceremony had officially ended, and most of the crowd was beginning to disperse when Karen made her move. The rational part of her mind, the part that usually prevented her from doing things she might regret, had been completely overwhelmed by months of building frustration and resentment. She pushed through the barriers that separated the spectators from the ceremonial area, her red jacket making her easily visible as she strode across the courtyard with determined steps. Thomas was still in formation, following protocol as the guards waited for their formal dismissal. He noticed the commotion before he saw Karen approaching, the murmur of confused voices and the sound of security personnel responding to the breach of protocol. When he finally saw her heading directly toward him, his training kicked in. Years of preparation had taught him to remain calm in unexpected situations, to assess threats without panic, and to protect the dignity of the ceremony above all else. Karen reached Thomas before security could intercept her. Without warning, without explanation, she grabbed the Distinguished Service Medal from his uniform and yanked it free, the pin tearing through the fabric and leaving a small but visible hole in his ceremonial jacket. The medal caught the sunlight as she held it above her head like a trophy, her voice rising above the shocked gasps of the crowd. "This doesn't belong to you," she shouted, her face flushed with anger and adrenaline. "My son deserved this more than you ever did. The whole system is corrupt and everyone needs to know it." Her words carried across the courtyard, recorded by dozens of smartphones and captured by news cameras that had been covering the ceremony. In that moment, Karen had turned what should have been Thomas's proudest professional achievement into a public humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his life. Thomas stood frozen, his military training warring with his human emotions. Protocol demanded that he remain at attention, that he not react to provocation, that he maintain the dignity of his position regardless of personal cost. But inside, he was reeling. The medal in Karen's hand represented 20 years of his life, countless sacrifices, and a recognition that meant more to him than she could possibly understand. Watching her wave it around like a prize she had won felt like having his heart torn from his chest. Security personnel finally reached Karen, but the damage was already done. As they gently but firmly escorted her away from Thomas, she continued, shouting about injustice and corruption, her voice growing more shrill with each word. The medal remained in her grasp, and Thomas could only watch as she was led toward the exit, taking with her the physical symbol of everything he had worked to achieve. The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Some people were angry on Thomas's behalf, shouting at Karen as security removed her from the area. Others were simply confused, trying to understand what had just happened and why anyone would do such a thing. Children who had been enjoying the pageantry of the ceremony were now frightened by the sudden chaos, clinging to their parents as voices rose around them. Sarah had watched the entire incident unfold from her position in the crowd, her 8-year-old daughter Emma beside her. The moment Karen grabbed the medal, Sarah felt her world shift. She knew how much this recognition meant to Thomas, understood the years of sacrifice and dedication it represented. Seeing it ripped away so casually, so cruelly, filled her with a rage she had never experienced before. But more than that, she was terrified about what this would mean for her husband's career, his reputation, and his emotional well-being. Emma didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could sense the wrongness of it. She had been so proud watching her father receive his medal, had been planning to tell all her friends at school about how brave and important her daddy was. Now she was watching a strange woman take something that belonged to him, and she couldn't understand why the adults were letting it happen. Tears began streaming down her face as she asked her mother, "Why did that lady take Daddy's medal? When will he get it back?" The commanding officer who had presented the medal was faced with an unprecedented situation. In decades of conducting ceremonial events, nothing like this had ever happened. The protocols and procedures that governed every aspect of royal ceremonies made no provision for dealing with theft during the presentation itself. He quickly ordered the remaining guards to maintain their positions while he coordinated with security to handle the immediate crisis. Media representatives who had come to cover what they expected to be a routine ceremony suddenly found themselves with a much bigger story. Video footage of Karen ripping the medal from Thomas's uniform began circulating on social media within minutes. News outlets started reaching out to their contacts, trying to understand who Karen was, why she had done what she did, and what the implications might be for the royal guard and the ceremony itself. Karen, meanwhile, was being processed by security in a small office adjacent to the courtyard. The adrenaline that had fueled her actions was beginning to wear off, replaced by a growing awareness of what she had actually done. The medal felt heavier in her hand now, not because of its physical weight, but because of the magnitude of her actions. Part of her remained convinced that she had been justified, that someone needed to expose what she saw as systemic unfairness. But another part of her was beginning to understand that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The security personnel were professional but firm as they questioned her about her motivations and background. They had already identified her through her identification and were running background checks to determine if she posed any ongoing threat to the royal family or the ceremony proceedings. Karen's answers were rambling and emotional, jumping between her son's failed applications to join the royal guard and her broader grievances against what she perceived as an unfair system. Back in the courtyard, Thomas finally received permission to break formation. The other guards offered quiet words of support and sympathy, understanding better than anyone what he was experiencing. They had all dedicated their lives to service, had all made similar sacrifices, and seeing one of their own treated so disrespectfully was deeply personal for each of them. The brotherhood that existed among the royal guard had never been more evident than in those moments after Karen's attack. As Thomas walked across the courtyard toward his family, he tried to process what had just happened. 20 years of preparation, months of anticipation, and a moment that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of his career had been destroyed by a stranger's anger. The hole in his uniform where the medal had been torn away felt like a wound that would never heal properly. Sarah embraced her husband when he reached them, feeling the tension in his shoulders and the weight of disappointment that surrounded him like a cloud. Emma wrapped her small arms around both her parents, still not fully understanding what had happened, but recognizing that something precious had been taken from her father. The three of them stood together in the emptying courtyard, trying to make sense of how such a perfect day had gone so terribly wrong. The aftermath of Karen's actions was just beginning to unfold, but already it was clear that the ripple effects would extend far beyond the brief moment of chaos she had created. Lives had been changed, reputations had been damaged, and a family's proudest moment had been transformed into their most painful memory. The police station where Karen was taken after being removed from the palace grounds was a stark contrast to the ceremonial grandeur she had just disrupted. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the gray walls, and the smell of industrial, cleaner mixed with coffee created an atmosphere that was both sterile and unwelcoming. Karen sat in a holding room, the Distinguished Service Medal still clutched in her hand, as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins had been called in to handle what was being described as a sensitive incident involving royal ceremony disruption. At 42, Collins had seen her share of unusual cases, but this was definitely a first. As she reviewed the preliminary reports and watched the video footage that had already been uploaded to social media, she tried to understand what could drive someone to such a public display of aggression against a decorated serviceman. When Collins finally sat down across from Karen in the interview room, she was struck by how ordinary the woman looked. Without the adrenaline and anger that had fueled her actions at the ceremony, Karen appeared tired and confused, like someone who had just woken up from a dream and couldn't quite remember where she was. The medal lay on the table between them, its gold surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Mrs. Henderson," Collins began, her voice professional but not unkind, "can you help me understand what happened today? Why did you feel compelled to take Mr. Mitchell's medal?" The question seemed to reactivate something in Karen, her posture straightening as she launched into an explanation that was part confession, part justification, and entirely heartbreaking in its sincerity. Karen talked about her son Jake, about his dreams of joining the Royal Guard, about the rejection letters that had arrived one after another, despite his best efforts to meet the standards required. She described the nights she had spent helping him train, the money they had invested in preparation courses, the hope they had both carried that dedication and determination would eventually be enough. With each word, it became clearer that her actions weren't really about Thomas Mitchell at all. They were about a mother's desperate attempt to make sense of her son's disappointments. Meanwhile, Thomas had returned home with his family, but the quiet celebration they had planned felt impossible under the circumstances. Emma kept asking about the medal, wanting to know when her father would get it back, whether the mean lady would be punished, and why anyone would want to take something that didn't belong to them. Each question was like a small knife twist in Thomas's chest, reminding him of how what should have been a perfect family moment had been stolen from them. Sarah Mitchell found herself in the unfamiliar position of trying to comfort her husband while managing her own anger and confusion. She had watched Thomas sacrifice so much for his career, missed birthdays, canceled vacations, late nights and early mornings that had become the rhythm of their family life. The medal ceremony was supposed to be validation that those sacrifices had meaning, recognition that his dedication mattered. Now, instead of celebrating his achievement, they were trying to figure out how to explain to their daughter why sometimes people do terrible things for reasons that make no sense. The story had already begun to spread beyond the local news outlets. Video clips of Karen grabbing the medal and Thomas's stunned reaction were being shared across social media platforms, generating thousands of comments and reactions. Some people expressed outrage on Thomas's behalf, calling Karen's actions unforgivable and demanding harsh punishment. Others tried to understand her motivations, wondering what could drive a mother to such desperate measures. Jake Henderson was at work in a London office building when his phone started buzzing with notifications. Friends and colleagues were sending him links to news articles and social media posts about his mother's actions at the palace. At 25, Jake had finally begun to make peace with his rejections from the Royal Guard, had started to build a different kind of life for himself. Now suddenly, his private disappointments were being dissected by strangers on the internet, and his mother had become the face of everything wrong with parents who couldn't accept their children's failures. The call from the police station came while Jake was sitting in a bathroom stall, trying to process what his mother had done and what it might mean for both of them. Detective Inspector Collins explained that Karen was being held pending charges, that she would need legal representation, and that there would likely be significant media attention around the case. Jake felt a mixture of love, anger, embarrassment, and protective instinct that made it hard to think clearly about what to do next. Back at the palace, officials were meeting to discuss the unprecedented breach of security and protocol. The incident raised questions about crowd control, screening procedures, and how to prevent similar disruptions in the future. More immediately, they needed to decide how to handle the media coverage and what message to send about the sanctity of royal ceremonies and the respect owed to servicemen like Thomas Mitchell. Thomas spent the evening in his study, staring at the empty case that had been prepared to display his Distinguished Service Medal. The velvet lining looked somehow accusatory, in its emptiness a reminder of what had been taken from him. He found himself wondering about Karen Henderson, trying to understand what could motivate someone to destroy a stranger's moment of recognition. Was her son really deserving of the position he had been denied? Had there been some injustice that Thomas was unaware of? The questions tormented him because Thomas was fundamentally a fair man. His 20 years of service had been built on principles of honor, duty, and justice. If there really had been corruption or favoritism in the selection process, if deserving candidates had been unfairly rejected, then maybe Karen's anger was justified even if her methods were inexcusable. The doubt was almost worse than the theft itself because it made him question not just what had happened, but whether he deserved the recognition he had lost. Sarah found him there around midnight, his shoulders slumped over the empty metal case. She had put Emma to bed hours earlier, after answering the same questions about the medal and the mean lady for the 20th time. Now she was faced with the more complex task of helping her husband process what had happened and find a way forward that didn't involve destroying himself with guilt and self-doubt. "It's not about whether you deserved it," she told him, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Someone took something that belonged to you, something that represented 20 years of your life. That's wrong, regardless of whatever else might be true." Her words were simple but profound, cutting through the complex emotions and moral questions to focus on the basic injustice of what had occurred. Detective Inspector Collins had stayed late to complete the initial paperwork on the case, but found herself thinking about the human elements that the legal process couldn't address. Karen Henderson would likely face charges for theft and disrupting a public ceremony. But what about the deeper issues her actions had revealed? What about the pain of a mother watching her son's dreams be repeatedly crushed? What about the impact on Thomas Mitchell's family, who had done nothing wrong but become victims of someone else's desperation? The medal still lay on the evidence table, its gold surface now smudged with fingerprints and somehow diminished by being removed from its proper context. Collins wondered if returning it to Thomas would restore its meaning, or if Karen's actions had permanently changed what it represented. Some things, once broken, could never be completely repaired, no matter how much effort was put into fixing them. As the night wore on, multiple families were struggling to understand how their lives had become entangled in such an unexpected way. Thomas and Sarah were trying to protect their daughter while processing their own emotions. Jake was deciding whether to visit his mother or distance himself from her actions. Karen was alone in a cell, finally beginning to comprehend the full scope of what she had done and what it might cost her. The morning after the incident brought a harsh new reality for everyone involved. Thomas woke to find dozens of missed calls on his phone, and reporters camped outside his modest suburban home. The story had exploded overnight, with news outlets picking up the social media footage and turning it into a national conversation about respect for military service, the pressures on parents, and the security of royal ceremonies. Emma couldn't understand why strange people with cameras were standing on their front lawn, asking questions about her daddy through the mail slot. Sarah had to explain that sometimes when unusual things happen, people want to tell stories about them, but that they should just ignore the noise and go about their normal day. It was advice that proved impossible to follow as reporters shouted questions about Thomas's service record and Karen's motivations every time anyone approached a window. At the police station, Karen had barely slept. The holding cell was cold and uncomfortable, but more than that, she was tormented by the growing realization of what her impulsive action had cost not just herself, but her son Jake. The news coverage she was allowed to see during her brief periods out of the cell painted her as either a villain who had attacked a war hero or a desperate mother driven to extremes by systemic injustice. Neither characterization felt accurate to her, but she was beginning to understand that her feelings about the matter were no longer relevant. Jake had called in sick to work, unable to face his colleagues after seeing his name and photo splashed across newspaper websites alongside his mother's. The articles detailed his failed applications to the Royal Guard, speculating about whether his rejections had been fair and whether Karen's actions revealed deeper problems with the selection process. Reading about his private disappointments in such public forums felt like having his wounds reopened and displayed for entertainment. Detective Inspector Collins arrived at the station early, knowing that the media attention would complicate what was already a sensitive case. She had spoken with prosecutors overnight, and they were leaning toward charging Karen with theft, disruption of a public ceremony, and possibly assault, depending on how Thomas wanted to proceed. The political dimensions of the case, involving royal ceremony and a decorated serviceman, meant that every decision would be scrutinized and debated in the press. When Collins sat down with Karen for their second interview, she found a different woman than the one she had spoken to the day before. The anger and justification had been replaced by a deep exhaustion and growing awareness of consequences. Karen had spent the night thinking about Jake, about how her actions might affect his future job prospects, his relationships, his ability to move forward from the disappointments that had led to this moment. "I keep thinking about his face when the letter came," Karen said, referring to Jake's final rejection from the Royal Guard. "He tried to hide it, but I saw how much it hurt him. He had wanted that job since he was a little boy, used to march around the house pretending to be guarding the Queen. When they said no for the third time, something just broke inside me." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and Collins could see tears forming in her eyes. The conversation revealed the depth of Karen's love for her son and the extent to which his disappointments had become her own. She had convinced herself that if she could just prove the system was unfair, if she could expose what she saw as corruption or favoritism, somehow Jake's rejections would be vindicated and his dreams could still come true. It was a mother's logic, protective and fierce but ultimately divorced from reality. Meanwhile, Thomas was meeting with officials from the Royal Guard to discuss how to handle the media attention and what the incident might mean for future ceremonies. The commanding officer assured him that a replacement medal would be prepared and presented as soon as possible, but Thomas found himself struggling to care about the physical object. The meaning of the recognition had been changed by Karen's actions, and he wasn't sure if a new ceremony could restore what had been lost. The officials were also concerned about the broader implications of the security breach. How had Karen been able to get so close to the guards during an active ceremony? What changes needed to be made to prevent similar incidents in the future? The questions were necessary, but felt like additional punishment to Thomas, as if his moment of recognition had created problems that needed to be solved, rather than celebrating achievements that deserved honor. Social media had turned the incident into a battlefield of competing narratives. Supporters of Thomas shared photos of other royal guards and stories about military sacrifice, using hashtags that demanded respect for servicemen and punishment for Karen. Meanwhile, others began sharing their own stories of children whose dreams had been crushed by rigid selection processes, wondering whether Karen's actions, while inexcusable, revealed genuine problems that needed attention. Jake found himself at the center of this online debate, with strangers dissecting his qualifications and speculating about why he had been rejected from the Royal Guard. Some people were sympathetic, understanding how devastating repeated rejections could be for a young person with military aspirations. Others were harsh, suggesting that if he couldn't meet the standards, he should have accepted reality rather than allowing his mother to fight battles on his behalf. The most painful comments were the ones that suggested Karen's actions had destroyed whatever small chance Jake might have had of eventually joining the Royal Guard or pursuing other military positions. His name was now permanently associated with disruption and disrespect toward the very institution he had hoped to serve. The irony was devastating. His mother's attempt to fight for his dreams had likely ended them forever. By midday, Jake had made the decision to visit his mother at the police station. The conversation with Detective Inspector Collins was awkward but necessary, as Jake tried to apologize for his mother's actions while also trying to understand what had driven her to such extremes. Seeing Karen in the holding cell, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he had ever seen her, broke something inside him. "Mom, what were you thinking?" he asked, his voice a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Did you really think taking that man's medal would somehow help me? Did you think it would change anything about my rejections or make the Royal Guard suddenly want to recruit me?" The questions hung in the air between them, highlighting the gap between Karen's intentions and the reality of what she had accomplished. Karen struggled to explain actions that even she was beginning to recognize as irrational. "I just wanted someone to pay attention," she said finally. "I wanted someone to acknowledge that the system might not be fair, that good people like you were being overlooked. I know it was wrong, but I didn't know how else to make anyone listen." The admission was both heartbreaking and infuriating, revealing the depth of her love and the extent of her poor judgment. Thomas spent the afternoon trying to return to normal routines. But everything felt different. His colleagues at the Royal Guard were supportive but awkward, unsure how to act around someone who had become the center of a national news story. The other guards offered condolences as if someone had died, which in a way felt accurate. Thomas Mitchell, who had received his medal in quiet dignity the day before, was gone, replaced by someone whose professional achievement would forever be remembered alongside the chaos Karen had created. Emma came home from school full of questions she hadn't thought to ask the night before. Her friends had seen the news coverage, and their parents had tried to explain what had happened. Now she wanted to know if the mean lady was in jail, whether her daddy was in trouble, and why people on TV were saying things about their family. Each question required careful navigation, as Thomas and Sarah tried to help their daughter understand complex adult emotions and motivations while protecting her innocence. The evening news coverage expanded the story beyond the basic facts of the incident. Reporters had tracked down Karen's neighbors, Jake's former teachers, and even some of Thomas's military colleagues, creating a comprehensive narrative about the two families whose lives had collided so dramatically. The coverage was invasive and often speculative, but it revealed the human complexity behind what could have been dismissed as a simple case of bad behavior. As night fell, both families were grappling with how permanently their lives had been changed by a few seconds of impulsive action. The medal that had started it all remained in police evidence, but its symbolic power had already been transformed in ways that couldn't be undone by simply returning it to its rightful owner. 2 weeks after the incident, the legal proceedings began in earnest, but the real battle was being fought in the court of public opinion and in the hearts of the families involved. Karen had been released on bail, thanks to Jake's efforts to secure legal representation, but she returned to a world that had fundamentally changed during her brief incarceration. Her neighbors looked at her differently. Her employer had placed her on indefinite leave pending the resolution of her case, and her own reflection in the mirror seemed to belong to a stranger. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, and both Karen and Thomas were required to attend. It would be the first time they had seen each other since the incident, and neither knew quite what to expect. Karen's lawyer, a young public defender named Marcus Webb, had spent hours trying to craft a defense strategy that acknowledged her actions while explaining the emotional circumstances that had led to them. Thomas arrived at the courthouse with Sarah, both of them walking past a small group of protesters who had gathered to show support for military veterans. The signs they carried read, "Respect our heroes and justice for Thomas," and while their intentions were good, the attention made Thomas uncomfortable. He had never wanted to be the center of a political movement, had never sought recognition. Beyond the quiet satisfaction of duty well performed. Inside the courthouse, Karen sat with Jake and her lawyer, trying to appear composed while her hands shook with nervous energy. She had lost weight during the 2 weeks since the incident, and the strain was visible in her face. Jake held her hand, offering what comfort he could while struggling with his own complex emotions about his mother's actions and their consequences. When Thomas and Karen finally made eye contact across the courtroom, something unexpected happened. Instead of the anger or resentment that both had anticipated, there was a moment of mutual recognition of shared humanity. Karen saw not the symbol of systemic injustice she had created in her mind, but a man who had been hurt by her actions. Thomas saw not a villain who had attacked him, but a mother whose love for her son had driven her to desperate measures. The hearing itself was largely procedural, with the judge setting dates for future proceedings and reviewing the charges against Karen. But the real drama occurred during the brief recess when Jake approached Thomas in the courthouse hallway. The young man's courage in facing the person his mother had wronged was evident in every step, and his words when he finally spoke were carefully chosen and deeply felt. "Mr. Mitchell," Jake began, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind it, "I need you to know how sorry I am for what my mother did. You didn't deserve that, and your family didn't deserve to have your special day ruined." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "I also need you to know that I never asked her to do anything like this. I never wanted anyone to fight my battles for me, especially not in a way that would hurt an innocent person." Thomas was struck by Jake's dignity and maturity in handling such a difficult situation. Here was a young man taking responsibility for actions that weren't his own, trying to make amends for damage he hadn't caused. It spoke to his character in a way that made Thomas understand why Jake had wanted to join the Royal Guard in the first place, even if he hadn't met the specific qualifications required. "I appreciate you saying that," Thomas replied, extending his hand to shake Jake's. "I can see that you're a good person who was raised by someone who loves you very much. Sometimes people who love us make mistakes trying to protect us, but that doesn't make them evil." The handshake lasted longer than usual, both men recognizing the significance of the moment and the humanity they shared despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Karen had watched this interaction from across the hallway, and, seeing her son's grace in such a difficult moment, broke her heart in new ways. She realized that Jake had become the man she had always hoped he would be, but that her actions had put him in a position where he needed to demonstrate that maturity by cleaning up her mistakes. The pride and shame she felt were almost overwhelming. After the hearing, the families went their separate ways, but the encounter had changed something for all of them. Thomas found himself thinking about Jake throughout the weekend, wondering about his career aspirations and whether there might be other ways for him to serve his country if the Royal Guard wasn't an option. The young man's character and dignity had made an impression that went beyond the circumstances of their meeting. Meanwhile, Jake was grappling with a new understanding of his mother's actions and his own role in what had happened. He had spent 2 weeks angry at Karen for embarrassing him and potentially destroying his future prospects, but seeing Thomas's humanity and grace in the courthouse made him realize that his mother's actions, while inexcusable, came from a place of genuine love and pain over his disappointments. The media coverage of the courthouse encounter focused on the handshake between Jake and Thomas, with many commentators praising both men for their dignity under difficult circumstances. Some articles began to shift away from the simple narrative of victim and villain, exploring instead the complex emotions and relationships that had led to the incident and were shaping its aftermath. Sarah Mitchell had watched her husband interact with Jake and seen something shift in his demeanor. The anger and hurt that had consumed Thomas since the medal incident seemed to be giving way to something more complex, a recognition that the situation was more nuanced than simple right and wrong. Victim and perpetrator. That evening, Thomas found himself researching Jake's background online, reading about his military training, his academic achievements, and his volunteer work with veterans organizations. The picture that emerged was of a dedicated young man who had genuinely wanted to serve his country, but had fallen short of the exceptionally high standards required for the Royal Guard. It wasn't a failure of character or commitment, just a gap between aspirations and qualifications that many good people experienced. Emma had been asking fewer questions about the mean lady lately, but she had started asking more about the boy she had seen on TV, Jake. With the straightforward curiosity of an 8-year-old, she wanted to know if he was sad that he couldn't be a guard like her daddy, and whether anyone was helping him find a different job that would make him happy. Her questions forced Thomas to think about Jake not as an abstract figure in a news story, but as a real person with hopes and disappointments. Karen spent her evenings walking around her neighborhood, trying to process the changes that 2 weeks had brought to her life. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid her, while others offered awkward words of support or understanding. The isolation was difficult, but it also provided time for reflection that she hadn't allowed herself before. She began to see how her focus on Jake's disappointments had prevented her from celebrating his other achievements and qualities. The legal proceedings continued to move forward, but both families were discovering that the formal justice system could only address part of what had happened. The theft charge was straightforward. Karen had taken something that didn't belong to her, and there would be consequences for that action. But the emotional damage, the broken trust in institutions, the family relationship strained by public scrutiny, these couldn't be resolved by a judge or jury. Jake had started meeting with a counselor, trying to work through his feelings about his mother's actions and his own role in what had happened. The counselor helped him understand that while he couldn't control his mother's choices, he could control how he responded to the situation and what he chose to do moving forward. The sessions were difficult but necessary, providing a space to process emotions that were too complex for friends or family to fully understand. One unexpected consequence of the media attention was the number of people who reached out to Jake with job opportunities and career advice. Veterans organizations, police departments, and private security firms had seen his dignity in handling the situation and were interested in talking to him about positions that might suit his skills and interests. The irony wasn't lost on him that his mother's attempt to force recognition of his worth had actually led to genuine opportunities, though not in the way she had intended. Thomas received his replacement medal in a quiet ceremony, attended only by his immediate family and commanding officers. The new medal was identical to the one Karen had taken, but its meaning had been fundamentally altered by everything that had happened. As Thomas held it, he thought about the young man whose mother's desperation had led to this moment, and he wondered whether there might be a way to turn the entire experience into something positive for everyone involved. The idea came to him gradually over several days of reflection. What if Jake's character and dignity in handling such a difficult situation demonstrated exactly the kind of person who should be serving his country, even if not in the Royal Guard? What if Thomas's position and reputation could be used not to seek revenge for what had been done to him, but to create opportunities for someone who deserved a chance to serve? Sarah was initially skeptical when Thomas shared his idea with her. After everything their family had been through, the suggestion that they should help Jake seemed almost incomprehensible. 3 months had passed since that fateful day at the palace, and autumn was painting the London streets in shades of gold and amber. The legal proceedings had concluded with Karen accepting a plea agreement that included community service, restitution, and a formal apology. The sentence was lighter than many had expected, partly due to Thomas's testimony about her character and circumstances, but the real consequences of her actions extended far beyond what any court could impose. Karen stood in the community center, where she now volunteered 3 days a week, helping coordinate support services for military families. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. The woman who had attacked a serviceman was now dedicating her time to helping the families of people like him. The work was humbling but meaningful, giving her insight into the real challenges faced by military families and the genuine sacrifices made by people like Thomas Mitchell. The other volunteers had been skeptical at first, knowing her story and wondering whether her presence was appropriate. But Karen's dedication and genuine remorse had gradually won over most of them. She never spoke about her own case unless directly asked, instead focusing entirely on the needs of the families she was trying to serve. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real and lasting. Jake had been working for 6 weeks at a private security firm that specialized in protecting government facilities. The job wasn't the Royal Guard position he had once dreamed of, but it allowed him to serve his country in a different way, while using the skills and training he had developed over years of preparation. More importantly, it had restored his sense of purpose and self-worth after the devastating publicity surrounding his mother's actions. The opportunity had come through an unexpected source: Thomas Mitchell himself. After weeks of consideration and discussion with his family, Thomas had reached out to colleagues in the security industry who were looking for dedicated personnel. He hadn't guaranteed Jake anything beyond an interview, but his recommendation carried weight in circles where character and integrity were valued above all else. When Jake learned that Thomas had been instrumental in helping him secure the interview, He was overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude and shame. The man his mother had wronged was now helping him build the career she had tried to destroy through her misguided actions. It was a lesson in grace that would shape Jake's character for the rest of his life. Thomas found that helping Jake had been more healing for his own wounds than any formal apology or legal resolution could have been. The young man's gratitude and dedication to making the most of his opportunity reminded Thomas why he had chosen a life of service in the first place. Sometimes the most profound victories came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into allies through unexpected kindness. The replacement medal now sat in Thomas's study, properly displayed and honored. But its meaning had evolved beyond simple recognition of past service. It had become a symbol of the choice between bitterness and grace, between holding grudges and creating opportunities for healing. When Emma asked about it during her homework time, Thomas would tell her stories not just about his own service, but about the importance of helping others, even when they hadn't been kind to you. Emma herself had played an unexpected role in the family's healing process. Her 8-year-old perspective had cut through adult complexities to focus on simple truths. That the mean lady had been sad about her son, that helping people was always better than hurting them, and that her daddy was a hero not just because of his uniform but because of how he treated people. Children often possessed moral clarity that adults had forgotten in their rush to assign blame and seek justice. Sarah had watched her husband's transformation with admiration and relief. The Thomas who had been consumed by anger and hurt immediately after the incident had gradually given way to someone who seemed more at peace with himself and his place in the world. The experience had tested their marriage and their family in ways they hadn't anticipated, but it had ultimately strengthened their bonds and clarified their values. The media attention had largely faded, replaced by newer controversies and more recent scandals. Occasionally, anniversary articles would resurface the story, usually focusing on themes of forgiveness and second chances. Jake and Thomas had both declined most interview requests, preferring to let their actions speak louder than their words. The real story was being written not in newspaper headlines but in the quiet daily choices both men made about how to treat others. Karen's relationship with Jake had been forever changed by what had happened, but not destroyed. The counseling they had attended together had helped them understand how her protective instincts had gone wrong and how to prevent similar problems in the future. Jake had forgiven his mother, but he had also established clearer boundaries about his own autonomy and decision-making. Their love remained strong, but it was now tempered by hard-won wisdom about the difference between supporting someone and trying to control their destiny. Detective Inspector Collins had followed the case, through its resolution and beyond, interested in the human elements that the legal system couldn't fully address. She had seen Karen's genuine transformation during her community service and Jake's dignified handling of his new opportunities. Most remarkably, she had witnessed Thomas's evolution from victim to advocate, using his experience to help create positive outcomes for everyone involved. The original medal, the one Karen had grabbed during that moment of desperate anger, had been returned to Thomas after the legal proceedings concluded. He had considered having it retired or replaced, but ultimately decided to keep it as a reminder of the complexity of human motivations and the power of choosing forgiveness over revenge. Sometimes the most valuable lessons came from the most painful experiences. On a crisp October morning, exactly 4 months after the incident, Thomas received an unexpected phone call. Jake was calling to invite him and his family to a small celebration. He had been promoted to a supervisory position at the security firm, recognizing both his professional competence and his leadership qualities. The invitation was formal but warm, acknowledging the role Thomas had played in making this achievement possible. The celebration was held at a quiet restaurant, attended by Jake's colleagues, his mother Karen, and the Mitchell family. It was an unusual gathering. The victim and perpetrator of a crime that had made national headlines now sharing a meal to celebrate new beginnings and second chances. Emma chatted excitedly with Jake about his new responsibilities, treating him like the older brother she had never had. When Jake stood to thank everyone for coming, his words were simple but profound. He spoke about the importance of learning from mistakes, both his own and others, and about the grace that had been shown to him when he least deserved it. He acknowledged his mother's love while taking responsibility for his own future, and he thanked Thomas not just for the job opportunity, but for demonstrating what true honor looked like in the aftermath of conflict. Thomas' quote. S. response was equally brief but heartfelt. He talked about the difference between being a victim and being a victor, about how the choice to help rather than harm could transform even the most painful situations into opportunities for growth and understanding. He looked at Karen as he spoke, acknowledging her presence and her transformation without dwelling on past mistakes. As the evening concluded, the three families had become something unexpected. Not exactly friends, but people bound together by shared experience and mutual respect. They had learned that healing didn't require forgetting what had happened, but it did require choosing to focus on what could be built, rather than what had been destroyed. The medal ceremony that had started it all felt like something from another lifetime, though it had been less than 6 months earlier. The recognition Thomas had received that day had been important, but the lessons learned in its aftermath had been invaluable. Sometimes the most significant moments in life weren't the ones that went according to plan, but the ones that challenged you to become better than you thought possible. Emma fell asleep in the car on the way home, exhausted from the excitement of the celebration and the late bedtime. As Thomas carried her into the house, she mumbled something about Jake being nice and her daddy being the best. It was the kind of simple validation that meant more than any medal ever could, a reminder that the most important recognition came from the people who knew you best and loved you most. In the end, Karen's desperate action had indeed changed lives, just not in the way she had intended. Instead of destroying careers and exposing injustice, her moment of poor judgment had created opportunities for growth, forgiveness, and unexpected connections between people who might never have met otherwise. The medal she had ripped away in anger had become a catalyst for grace, teaching everyone involved that sometimes the most profound victories come not from getting what you think you deserve, but from giving others what they need to heal and grow.